Our scripture reading comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. May the Lord bless the reading and the hearing of his word.
So in our office, it is a well-known fact that Zach Cheeseman, who's our guitar player and our youth director, that Zach and I are comic book nerds. And so very often, he'll pop in my office or I'll pop in his office and we'll talk about this latest show or movie or comic book. And whenever we do, the whole office groans. Even Tracy, wonderful Miss Tracy, will shout out, "Nerds," which would be hurtful if it wasn't done in love. But anyways, I can't help it. I grew up reading comic books, loving comic books, and now, all these movies from MCU and DC, they bring these characters that I knew as a child to life, and I love it. Even the bad Marvel movies, which there's been a lot lately. Still, hope springs eternal. I keep going to it, right? So I was thinking about today's scripture reading, and I was focused on one word, whosoever, and I immediately thought not of the Bible, but my mind went to Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Thank you for the laughter in the back. That's where I went first. Because if you know the story at all, King Odin, his father, speaks an incantation over the hammer that goes like this: "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." So whosoever, anyone who holds the hammer can have that power. But the trick is that conditional qualifier, if he be worthy. And that's kind of what the first Thor movie is about Thor learning what it means to be worthy. It's not just about being strong or even just being brave, but it's about sacrificing, laying down your life for others. That's how he proves his worthiness. Fast forward a number of Marvel films, and you get to the Avengers, Age of Ultron, and their Avengers are all having a party kind of at the beginning of the movie, and at the end of the party, they all decide let's see who can lift Thor's hammer. And one by one, all the Avengers, Captain America, Iron Man, they all kind of grab and try to lift this hammer. And despite all their strength and all their technology, none of them can do it. It's kind of like a sword in the stone type moment. It turns out, in the MCU and Marvel's, whosoever is actually a pretty limited number of people. Now, in John's gospel, whosoever kind of has a different sense. It has a broad meaning. And it shows up again and again and again in John's gospel, particularly in relationship to the I am statements that we're considering between now and Easter. Well, let's start with John 3:16, which you see there on the screen. "For God so loved the world," we all know it, right? "That he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not die but have everlasting life." Or last week we considered the first I am statement. This is John 6:35. It says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me," we can say whosoever if you want to speak in old King James language, but "whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never thirst." And then, and today, the second of the I am statements, again, Jesus repeats this same promise: "I am the light of the world. Whosoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." It's beautiful, isn't it? this promise of whosoever, because it's open to everyone. In contrast to, the Marvel movies, what was the qualifier in the Marvel movies? Whosoever sounds so broad, but it was if he be worthy. So worthiness is the key to being able to lift Thor's hammer. But in the Gospels, what's the qualifier? What comes after whosoever? What do we have to do? Whosoever believes in me. Whosoever comes to me. Whoever follows after me. Whoever trusts in me. That's the pathway to life. Whosoever believes receives light and life and hope and satisfaction and wholeness. That's the promise Jesus makes. And the beautiful thing about this whosoever is that it's open to everyone. In Greek, it's a much shorter word, pas, which means all. Everyone who believes has access to this life that Jesus offers. Now here's the trick, though. John wants us to understand just how powerful this whosoever, he wants to demonstrate that anyone can have the light and life of Jesus. And so he chooses as a character to illustrate this promise, a blind man, a man who is born, in fact, not just blind, but born blind. Now, the Bible doesn't say he was a beggar, but that's clearly a sense of the text, because the disciples are walking along with Jesus and they see him on the side of the road. And when they see him, come across him, the disciples ask Jesus a question. They're probably in earshot of this man, but they don't speak to him. They speak over him, about him. You know when you're a kid and your parents talk about you and you're like, hey, I'm right here. That's how much of a non-person this blind man was. Maybe he's used to people speaking over him. And the disciples ask, they say, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus responds to them and says, neither this man nor his parents, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We'll come back to that at the very end. That's a powerful sentence. So that the works of God might be displayed in him. And then he said to them, while it is light, we must do the works of God. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And then Jesus bent down. Instead of speaking over the blind man, he spoke to him. And he spit on the ground and made mud with his own saliva and put it on his eyes and instructed him, go to the pool of Siloam and wash there and recover your sight. And sure enough, the man went. He washed his eyes as Jesus directed. And lo and behold, he could see. For the first time in his life, he opened his eyes, and there was something that he could see. And he rejoiced and celebrated. And everyone who knew the man, recognized that this was a miracle from God and joined in the celebration. Everyone, that is, except for the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees, here's the deal. When Jesus healed the blind man, it was the same as when he healed the lame man, which we talked about a handful of weeks ago. It was on a Sabbath, which meant Jesus broke the law in healing this blind man, at least in the Pharisees' eyes. He was a rule breaker, and so this put Jesus again right in their crosshairs. And so what did they do? They scooped up this man in the midst of his celebration, and they interrogated him. They placed him in front of a council, and they interrogated him about Jesus and put pressure on him to denounce the good thing that had just happened to him. Now, John's gospel is always a study in contrast. He's always kind of giving like two options. And so I think we're intentionally meant to compare this blind man and the group of Pharisees that were interrogating him. And you'll see there's just plenty of contrast between them. Let's start with the first one, the most obvious. The blind man had vulnerability. The Pharisees had authority. The Pharisees had all the power in this story, right? This past Wednesday, at Ash Wednesday, I talked about vulnerability and authority. If you missed the service, you can watch it online sometime. But vulnerability, this is a word that comes from Andy Crouch. He kind of defines vulnerability as exposure to meaningful risk. And authority he defines as capacity to take meaningful action. The Pharisees were the authorities in this moment. They had the capacity to bless, sanctify, restore this blind man to society, to recognize Jesus. They had the authority. They could have led the people in that direction, but they didn't use their authority in that way. Instead, they used their authority to exploit and to intimidate others. And meanwhile, the blind man was completely vulnerable. He stood alone before the Pharisees. He was at their mercy in more ways than one. And yet, we'll see by the end of the story, even in his vulnerability, he claimed some authority for himself. Moving on, though. We'll get to that at the end. The Pharisees, perhaps because of their authority, they were arrogant. And with arrogant, I mean they were confident in their own self-righteousness. They were confident in the purity of their lives. They were confident in their understanding of the law. They were confident in their judgment about Jesus and others. They were so confident of their rightness that they couldn't see their blindness. You ever known someone like that? Who's so confident of their rightness, they can't see where they're wrong? On the other side, you got the blind man, who is a picture of humility. And here's, to me, the key word that displays the humility of the blind man. On multiple occasions in this story, he simply says the three words, "I don't know." They ask him, "Where is Jesus?" "I don't know." "Is he a sinner?" "I don't know." "Surely, tell the truth, this man has sinned again." "I don't know." He didn't know if Jesus was a prophet or a blasphemer or a sinner. He knew one thing. "One thing I know, I was blind, but now I see." He knew the goodness of God, the goodness of Jesus, and that's all he needed to know. He acknowledged in humility the limits of his understanding, and yet he claimed with faith the thing that Jesus had done for him. Not only that, so here's the contrast. So he was humble. He didn't posture. He didn't proclaim to teach or preach or any of those things. And yet, in his humility, he had a courage to stand up for the truth, right? And this becomes apparent when we see how the Pharisees were treating him. That they wanted him to confess one thing, that Jesus was a sinner, that he wasn't good, that he wasn't certainly not the Messiah. And so that's what they want, and they applied all kinds of pressure to get this man to confess that. They not only interrogated him, they brought his parents before the council and interrogated and pressured them. And the parents, like, this gives you a picture, because imagine these parents, right? Their son, who was born blind, is now able to see. And surely they were happy for him. Surely they rejoiced in this miracle. But in that moment before the Pharisees, they shrank back. At the beginning, they kind of employed the same tactic the blind man did of, like, here's what I know, but here's what I don't know. They said, we know he's our son, and we know he was born blind, but how he can see now and who opened his eyes, we don't know. And then it becomes clear, as the Pharisees keep pressuring them for answers, they say, ask him. He's of age. Let him speak for himself. They get out of the crossfires and they put the crossfire back on their son. Why? Because they were afraid of the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees had predetermined that anyone who stood with Jesus was going to be cast out of the synagogue. Which means, it's not just like being kicked out of church. It's like being kicked out of society, being excommunicated and shunned. And the parents were afraid. Which makes it so remarkable that this solitary blind man, formerly blind man, stood his ground. And not only did he refuse to confess that Jesus was a sinner, by the end of it, he actually became a teacher to the Pharisees. He says, this is remarkable. When they kept saying this man is a sinner, he says, this is wrong. You don't know where he comes from or how he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, though. He only listens to the godly person who does his will. If this man were not from God, he said, then God would not listen to him. It's like the little kid who shouts out, the emperor has no clothes. The blind man is the only person in the story who says the Pharisees, for all of their power and authority, were really afraid. Because that's really what was happening to the Pharisees. Underneath all that power and authority, they were afraid. They weren't just intimidated by Jesus or jealous of him. It wasn't just that he was a rule breaker. They were afraid, not of Jesus, but of the Romans. That's who the Pharisees were most afraid of. If you fast forward, a couple of chapters into John chapter 11, when they finally made the decision to have Jesus killed, it was on this basis. They said if more and more people keep believing in Jesus and following him and proclaiming him the Messiah, then the Romans are going to come and they will destroy not only him, but they'll destroy our nation and our temple too. They were afraid. And out of their fear, they used fear to intimidate and manipulate others. And perhaps the most important contrast of all was the blind man had faith. And he demonstrated this faith over and over again in the story. In the beginning, when Jesus put mud on his eyes and said, "Go wash yourself," he listened, he obeyed, he trusted that Jesus had the power to do something new and real in his life. He had faith when he stood before the council. Even though he was a solitary individual, he had faith that Jesus was good. He didn't know anything else, but he knew that. And then after the Pharisees kicked him out of their presence, removed him from the synagogue, Jesus sought him out. And Jesus sought him out and asked him a simple question: do you believe in the Son of Man? And the blind man said, "Well, who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." And then Jesus said, "You have now seen him. You have now seen him. You who were blind, you see him. He is the one standing before you right now." And the blind man said simply, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. And that simple confession is all that was needed. He was a whosoever from that point on. The Pharisees, on the flip side, were not. Because instead of confessing faith, they practiced denial. And when I say denial, I'm not speaking about doubt. I want to be clear about this. Doubt is part of faith. Doubt is faith seeking understanding. Denial is an oppositional stance to faith. It's refusing to believe the thing that is right in front of your very eyes. And that's what the Pharisees did. Despite the repeated miracles and wonders that Jesus, despite all the evidence that was right in front of them, they refused to believe in Jesus. They denied who he was. They denied the miracles that he did. And not only that, they even denied their own blindness. At the very end of the story, when the blind man bows down and worships Jesus, he says, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and that those who see will become blind." And the Pharisees overhear this, and they say, "Wait, are you saying we're blind now?" And Jesus sadly says, "If you were blind," in other words, if you confessed you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. You could be forgiven just like this man. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. The Pharisees' denial kept them from receiving the grace and forgiveness that Jesus came to offer. So there you have it. This is the final picture. And like I said, John gives us this clear contrast between these two. And I want you to note the progression on each column, right? How one man moves from vulnerability, humility, courage, faith, and ends in sight. And the other person, a group of people, They start with authority, but that leads to arrogance, fear, denial, and ultimately blindness. This is what scholars call the great reversal that takes place again and again and again in John's gospel. And John puts this clearly before us, this dichotomy. It's a great biblical tradition because he wants us to choose which ones we will be. As Moses did with the people of Israel in the desert, he says, I set before you this day, I call heaven and earth to witness against me, that I have set before you death and life, blessings and curses. Choose life, that it may go well with you. And that's what John is doing. He is setting before us death and life, blessing and curses. He's saying this is what it looks like to believe in and follow Jesus. And this is what it looks like to deny him. Choose life. Which one will you be? Or to use John's own words, this is what it looks like in the blind man. For the works of God to be displayed in us. If that's what we want, which wouldn't that be wonderful? To be able to say, the works of God have been displayed in me. That this is the pathway we take. Vulnerability, humility, courage, faith, ending in sight. And so, drawing on the blind man's example, I offer these 3 final points. If we are to imitate him, if the works of God are going to be completeness, we have to do 3 things at least. First, in humility, we must acknowledge our need. Acknowledge the limits of our understanding, acknowledge that we don't know it all. We're capable, just as capable as the Pharisees of getting it wrong. 1 John 1:9 says, if we say there is no darkness in us, if we say we are without sin, then the light of Christ is not in us. But if we confess our sin, he who is faithful and just will forgive us our sin and cleanse us of our unrighteousness. First thing we have to do is acknowledge our sin and our need of Christ. Secondly, I think we're called, like the blind man, to stand up for truth. Which truth is a loaded word in today's world, isn't it? Like we are bombarded with so much information, it is hard to know what the truth is. And it's even harder, I think, to stand up for it. Because it's easy to be intimidated or silenced or just to kind of go along with the crowd. And so we have to really, and again, I'm not saying we act like the Pharisees, confident of our own rightness. Instead, we have to be like the blind man and make Christ the center of our understanding, our vision, that everything is weighed against the truth of the gospel, what Jesus taught and how Jesus lived. That becomes the truth for which we stand. And then lastly, kind of growing off of that, is we follow Jesus. By faith, we claim the truth, the hope, that he is the light of the world, that he is the one who lights up our darkness. He is the one who scatters the lies of the world. He is the one who brings hope and salvation. He is the light. And we have this beautiful promise that whosoever follows him, which can be you and me, if we follow Jesus as our light, we will never walk in darkness, for his light will illuminate our path, and he will give to us the light of life everlasting. Amen.